Managing your SQL Server database from one central location, great idea. Automating it, that's even better. Microsoft introduced policy-based management as a way to achieve that goal. Introduced in SQL Server 2008, and in this video, we're going to show you how to use SQL Server's policy-based management. So the overview for this video will include, first of all, looking at the benefits of policy-based management. Following that, we're going to jump into some key concepts and key terms, because in order to work with any new technology, you have to understand the lingo. So we're going to lay that foundation, and then we'll jump into something called policy-based management evaluation modes. We'll look at those, define those, show those come into play, and then we're going to jump into using policy-based management to enforce naming conventions in our Veronica's database. And we'll talk about the new surface area configuration tool. I'm kind of using that tongue-in-cheek. There is no new surface area configuration tool. It died at the end of SQL Server 2005. What we use in place of it is policy-based management to provide the same functionality, but we'll talk about that. Security considerations. There's always security when you're dealing with data. We'll look at how that comes into play with PBM. We'll look at a roadmap after we've gone through actually configuring policy-based management and enforcing policies. I want to summarize it with just a list of here are the steps you need to do to enforce policies using policy-based management, and then a quick things to remember list, just kind of some key things to keep in mind when you're looking at policy-based management. Before we talk about how to use policy-based management, let's spend a little more time talking about what is it and why do I need it. Policy-based management, and forgive me if I start saying PBM because it's a whole lot easier. What it's going to do is it's going to give you an automated way to enforce whatever rules that have been established by your organization. Let's say you have established naming conventions for tables or views, or you have established what options will be turned on or what options will be turned off across your servers. Policy-based management allows you to set that once and enforce it automatically using SQL Server policies. Not only does it enforce the creation of new tables, the creation of new triggers, and whatever rules you want to apply to them, it also monitors any changes that occur in real time. So let's say someone decides to rename a table that was in compliance, making it no longer compliant. Policy-based manager can monitor that and can give you various options as to how you respond to that. You can block the change, or you can simply note the change and let it take place. Anytime you can centralize the management of your server, and anytime you can take the rules that you've established in your organization and build them into your application, at least in a way that they're easily accessible, that's usually a good idea. And policy-based management allows you to do that. You have centralized control, and you can now build into your application the business logic and the rules that you've established for your application and for your organization. Policy-based management isn't limited to administering a single server. You can create a single policy and then apply that policy to multiple servers across your organization, which gives you a great way to enforce compliance across your organization. So it doesn't matter if you have 1 or 150 servers. Policy-based management allows you to keep all of them in compliance. When working with policy-based management, you're allowed to configure it all from scratch, or you have many out-of-the-box policies that are commonly encountered situations that you can apply to your particular environment. In SQL Server 2005, we said goodbye to the Surface Area Configuration tool. A recommended practice with SQL Server is never enable more features than you actually need. That's your surface area. The more things that are turned on, that's the more points of access the outside world has to your server. So any service you don't need, leave it off. Any process you don't need, disable it. The Surface Area Configuration tool gave you a way to do that. Well, that's no longer available in 2008. The new method is the Policy-Based Management tool. This is now the tool that allows us to, in addition to everything else it can do, manage our surface area. Whenever you start looking at a new area of SQL Server, you're going to get a whole new set of terms and concepts, at least most of the time. Policy-based management is no exception. Starting with the concept of a target. Now, if you've worked with SQL Server or maybe even almost any Microsoft Server product, the concept of a target isn't going to be very new. It's really an object. Anything that you can manipulate, any noun that's part of the system, that's a target. When you're looking at policy-based management, targets are the things that we manage. And all of our targets are ordered in a target hierarchy. We can group our targets and form what are known as target sets by applying filters whenever we query a list of targets from the target hierarchy. That's very helpful when you want to apply policies to a subset of the entire hierarchy. The first two items on the list aren't necessarily specific to policy-based management. Facets, however, are. I talked about targets as the things you manage with policy-based management, but PBM gives you more finely tuned control than simply managing the entire object. Objects have properties, right? That's object-oriented programming, object-oriented design 101. When you manage an object, you don't necessarily need to or want to manage every single property of that object. You may only be interested in 1 or 2 or 5 specific properties. A facet is a specific property of a target that you can manage. When we get into actually applying our policies, we'll see lists of facets that we can then apply a policy to. When we apply a policy to a facet, which is a component of a target, we have rules that are associated with that policy. This particular entity can never have this certain property on, or the name property can never have certain characters or should always have certain characters. Those are characteristics that when you apply them to a particular facet on a particular target, they will evaluate to either true, it's in compliance, or false, it's not in compliance. So one of the things we're going to create when we set up policy-based management will be our conditions, which will then evaluate to true or false. Once we have identified the facet we want to manage on a particular target, once we have created the conditions that can evaluate to true or false, we next build the policy, which is made up of a condition and the expected result when comparing that condition to the facet. So it's really a set of rules. And then last on this list, we can create policy categories. Policy categories are nothing more than a way to group your policies. As you begin to utilize this, you'll oftentimes find yourself dealing with dozens of policies. But those policies will oftentimes fall into certain groupings or categories. Policy categories give you an actual system device for physically, or I should really say logically, because there's no physical change, logically grouping those policies for easier management. So enough talking about policies. Let's apply one. What we're going to do here, in our Veronica's database, we've determined we want to use certain naming restrictions for our tables. Using policy-based management, I can enforce that rule. I can enforce a rule that says anytime a new table is created, it must comply with these naming standards or I won't allow it to be created. I can also say if I try to rename a table or rename an object, once again, I can disallow that change, or I could simply say log the change. But here, let's move over to the server and actually do it. So I'm going to start by bringing up the Management Studio. Go ahead and log in using my MDM account. If I go to the Management folder, expand that. The first thing under that list is Policy-Based Management. There. Expand that, and we start by creating a new condition. So I'll right-click on Conditions, go to New Condition, and that'll bring up my New Condition dialog. Using that, I'm going to create my condition and start by giving it a name, and I'll just call it Veronica Tables. As far as the facet, In this particular case, we're using the multi-part name facet because we want to allow for multi-part names, but we want to force it to start with a certain prefix. In the expression field, here's where I tell it that I'm dealing with the names as opposed to a schema. Name is like, not necessarily equal to, but like. Those my options are equal to, not equal to, like, in a subset, not like. I can't have a certain thing in there or not in, but we want like. And then I'm going to give it a value. And let's say I want all of my tables to start with Veronica's or VV underscore. Put that in single quotes with a % sign to say and anything else. I can then add a description to this. All tables must start with VV underscore. Click OK on that, and my new condition is in place. Now for my policy, if I right click on policies, go to new policy, Veronica's table name policy. What condition do I want to use? If I hit the drop down, I see my one and only condition that I've created so far. And the against targets, here's where I tell it that it does indeed go against tables. Just calling it Veronica tables doesn't cause that to happen. But here, saying every table in every database, right? Or I could specifically say only the Veronica's database by creating a new condition. Veronica's only. For facet, I do want database. I again want name, or at name, equal to this case, in this case, Veronica's. I want an exact match. Hit tab for it to evaluate that. I get an OK, I get a ready. Click OK, takes me back to the previous screen. And now, evaluation mode. My choices are on demand. I can go in and manually have it checked. On schedule, set up a timer. Log only, just write it down, let it fly, don't police it. Or prevent. Now let's go with prevent. Server restrictions, I'm going to leave that to none. No other conditions to add to that. And I need to specifically enable this one. Had I picked, for example, on demand, notice enable is no longer an option because it's not going to run on its own. So you don't enable or disable that one. And then I can go over here and put a description. Veronica's table name policy. I can also do some cool stuff with hyperlinks to web pages, internal web pages. Let's say I have a company intranet with more information. I can create hyperlinks to those internal websites, so even external sites, with more information. I'll click OK. So I've got my condition, got my policy. I can see all those right here. If I expand, I can see my two conditions I've created now. I can see my policy I've created. Next, to create what's known as my category. Again, I start with my Object Explorer, and in my Management folder, go back to Policy Management. Right-click, and I have an option here that says Manage Categories. Here into the Name field, I'm just going to give it a name of my current database, which is Veronica's. I'm going to clear the mandate database subscriptions. If I didn't clear that, it would force all databases to subscribe to this category. I don't want that. I want to specifically apply it to my Veronica's database. I'll go ahead and click OK for that. And then next, I want to subscribe to this new policy. So now I can close out my management interface, expand my databases folder, and go to Veronica's. If I right-click on Veronica's and go to Policies, there's an option here to view the various policies that I've already adhered to, which there are none. I can go to Categories to see the categories of policies. I can actually evaluate my compliance with an existing policy. So here, let's go to Categories, because we just created one. There's my new category I created by Veronica's. Can't see it here because it's kind of squished. If I expand that, you can see here's my subscribed checkbox. Click that, and I am now a subscriber to this policy. Click OK. Well, now I am actually. Click OK. Now here, let's try something. We said all tables have to start with VV underscore. So I'll just say use Veronica's create table. Let's give me a new table with a real generic column, column 1. Give it a generic data type. Doesn't really matter. Do go. Hit F5 to run this. In a few seconds, I should see an error saying you can't do this, along with the name of the policy that was violated. And there it is. Policy Veronica's table name policy has been violated when I attempted to create a new table called dbo.newTable. It goes on to say will be rolled back. Policy condition, the name like this exact condition we created. My description. If I add other help files, like I said, that would be listed here as well. So what I need to do to make this actually fly is simply add that prefix, hit F5 again, and within seconds, which is typical, I see my new table. Okay, expand that, go to tables. Now I didn't have this policy in effect before I started, right? So I can't have other tables in here that do not comply, but any new table created going forward will adhere. So it gives you a way to group things where you've come up with a naming scheme that's going to make it easier to understand what's going on in your environment. I highly, highly recommend you do that. But then how do you make sure everybody follows it? Put a cop at the front door and say you have no choice. And that's what your policy-based management allows you to do. In your SQL Server environment, there's a myriad of services that can be turned on, that can be turned off, some of which the default state is on, some the default state is off. You want to control that. You want to determine what's on, what's off, and then make sure that your decisions are maintained. Policy-based management allows you to do that by giving you the ability to control your feature states. So for example, SQL Server comes with a built-in default trace that's always running in the background. It doesn't take up a lot of resources, writes a minimal amount of data. But if you don't need it to be on, if you've already determined that the information it's giving you you don't have a need for, you could determine that you want to turn it off and you want to ensure that it remains off. Policy-based management allows you to do that. In this next demo, we're going to use policy-based management to turn database mail off so that no user is allowed to send messages directly from SQL Server. So in this case, I want to look at how do I turn off certain features. And for SQL Server 2008, we no longer have the surface area configuration wizard. That was a tool that allowed us to minimize what features were on, minimize the surface area, so to speak, or the attack surface in your SQL Server environment. What we have in place of that wizard, however, is now the policy-based management system. So if I go to management again, expand management, expand policy management. If I right-click on conditions, I can create a new condition that specifically says make sure certain features are on or off, and typically in this case you want off. I'm going to give it a name. Since I'm going to focus on, I'll just grab mail for now, right? Database mail. So I want database mail always off. Here's a list of all the facets, all the things that I can apply this to. We are specifically looking at surface area configuration as the facet we want to focus on. Now notice there's a couple other variations of that. There's a surface area configuration focused on analysis services as well as on reporting services, but we're not doing that right now. We're just doing generic database stuff. So I'll do surface area configuration. And now I tell it what features I want to make sure are disabled. So I have database mail here. I'm going to have operator is equal to, and then the value of false. Enabled equals false. And we need to grab a couple of things. Because we want database mail disabled. If we want to make sure there's no, wrong button there, we want to make sure there's no mail turned on. The other thing I want to grab is SQL mail. Make sure that is also enabled equals false. And add a description. All SQL Server mail disabled. Go back to general, make sure I didn't type anything wrong. Database mail looks good. Surface area. Click OK. And I've created my new condition. Here's my database mail condition. And a couple other conditions I created before. Once I have the condition, the next step is to create the policy again. Right click, new policy, give it a name again. What condition do I want to use? I have my database mail condition. I can apply this against multiple targets if I wanted to, but in this case we're only going to hit our one server. Evaluation mode. This is something I'm going to do in this case on demand. So I'll just leave it set to on demand, and I can add description. Click OK. Policies in place. And now if I right click on the server, go to policies, go to evaluate. Here I can see a list of my policies. It's not real easy to see. They've got a light blue on a dark blue background. It's actually a hyperlink. If I click on it, you can see it turn red, and I can get into the configuration screen to modify that policy. But for now, I just want to run it. I want to evaluate it. If I hit the checkbox and click evaluate, it will attempt to find any inconsistencies between my policy and my current environment. Green check, or actually a green circle with a white check, right, says that no inconsistencies were found. If it found an inconsistency, I'd see red. Again, I have a hyperlink here for details. It says view. I click on view, I can get more detailed information about where the policy was applied and the specific results of each portion of it. So I can see I got a green circle for each portion of that. So everything's off, exactly like I want. So I've used policy-based management to, in this case, evaluate whether or not my server was in compliance. Now, I could have also forced compliance. Anytime someone tried to change it, have it prevent the change. So you have a few different options when working with policy-based management. So here, let's close this out and continue on. When we talk about security and policy-based management, the primary focus is the policy administrator role. It's one of the built-in database roles available in SQL Server, and it's only available in the MSDB database. It's the MSDB database that will be used as a repository for all of the policies, conditions, and anything else that we set up specific to policy-based management. Members of the policy administrator role will be able to subscribe to any policy, enable or disable any policy, as well as create policies and execute a policy. That's the primary role you're going to use for anyone who's going to be in charge of your policy-based management. Other roles or accounts to note include the system admin or DBO. Those two will be able to subscribe to any policy. The current user has the ability to do an ad hoc execution of a policy. Whenever you do that, however, that particular user's permissions will also be applied to the policy when it's running. So for example, if that user has no rights to turn on or turn off a particular feature or component, running the policy will fail if it attempts to do something that that user is not authorized to do themselves. And then last on the list, the SA account, the built-in system admin account that's part of SQL Server. Whenever we have policies scheduled to run automatically at periodic intervals, those policies will run under the SA account. Therefore, if you're using policy-based management, you do not want to disable your SA account. It's oftentimes a good idea, if you're not using the SA account, to disable it. One exception is if you're running policy-based management, even though you're not using it directly, you are using it indirectly anytime you have scheduled policies. But before we go on, let's back up a little bit. I want to focus a little more on the policy administrator role. Let's move over to the server, and I want to walk you through adding user accounts, a process that you're probably familiar with already, but we're going to walk through that process, and we're going to walk through adding a user to the policy administrator role. So let's bring up our Management Studio. Go Start, SQL Server Management Studio. Going in as administrator. And I've been making this easy for now for demonstration purposes, but in our production environment, we don't want easy, we want secure, right? So I've already added my MDM account. If you go to Security, go to Logins, I have my MDM account already added to my environment. If I go to my Veronica's database, go to Security, go to Users, MDM isn't added here yet. So I'll go ahead and add MDM here as a new user. Hit my ellipse button. Object types to browse are logins. Click Browse. And I can see all the logins that exist in this server. Select MDM. It's part of my MELS domain. Click OK. OK again. I could have just typed it in, but why risk typing it wrong, right? Now give it a name. And for simplicity, I'll go ahead and call it MDM again. And I'm going to make this account a database owner. Click OK. So I've added the account to this database. Now, I want this account to be able to completely control and manage my policy-based management. In order to do that, I want to utilize the built-in structure of SQL Server. SQL Server provides a role, a database role, that supports policy-based management. Now, policy-based management configuration settings are all saved in one location. Here, let's look at that. If I go to System Databases, the MSDB database is where you will find all of your policy settings. In addition to the policy settings, the MSDB database contains a database role that can be used to give rights, access, permission to control your policies. If I go to Security, I have a user folder and a roles folder. First, let's add MDM as a user. Right click, new user. Same thing as with the Veronica's database. I'm looking at logins. Click Browse. Select the login, click OK. Click OK again. Give it a name, and for simplicity again, I'm calling it MDM. And now, if I scroll down this list, I'll have some different roles. Policy Administrator role. Selecting that role allows MDM to administer my policy-based management. Click OK. And I'm done. So we've applied policy-based management in two different scenarios to our Veronica's database. But here, let's recap the steps, because it can kind of seem like a lot of steps, but it really isn't, especially if you get them all in one place. The first thing you want to do is determine and configure any policy-based management user accounts. Who's going to have the rights and the access to administer this? Next, you want to determine a policy-based management facet that contains the properties you need to configure. Third, define a condition that specifies the state of that facet. Should it be on? Should it be off? Should it have certain naming constraints? Those are the types of conditions you want to consider. Next, you define a policy that contains your condition. Fifth, you may need to define additional conditions to filter the target set. For example, you only want this policy to apply to tables that are part of one schema versus another. And you'll also need to determine what is your evaluation mode. Next, you subscribe to the policy. And then last, you evaluate whether an instance of SQL Server is in compliance with your policy or not in compliance. So we're going to finish this video out with, first of all, a few key things to remember. Your policy administrator role, and unlike many of the other built-in roles, this one actually includes the word role in the name, so you'll hear me say policy administrator role. You only want to grant that to users who are trusted with configuring your database engine. You don't want to just flippantly, carelessly give that ability away. People with policy administrator role can limit, hinder, disable various features within your environment. So you want to be careful with that. Second, watch out for any side effects with any server-wide policy. So for example, let's say you put a policy in place that requires all tables to have an index. Well, there are certain built-in system tables that SQL Server uses as part of its internal operations that don't include indexes. So forcing SQL Server to change the way it manages its own internal table structure would have some negative consequences, to say the least. So you want to be careful anytime you implement any policies that are just server-wide. Typically, you want to focus it on a particular database or a particular set of databases. And I just wanted to reiterate where your policies saved. They're saved in one of your system databases, specifically the MSDB database. So that means when you make changes to your policies, what do you back up immediately? Your MSDB database, right? As a good administrator, you want to make sure every change you've made is saved so you can easily recover it. Now, if it's one little minor change, you can make the call to not necessarily back up in that case. My rule of thumb, if it was worth taking the time to do it, it's worth taking the time to back it up. And then in closing, what did we cover? We talked about the benefits of policy-based management, why you need it, and how it helps you get your job done. We talked about how I can use it to enforce naming conventions. We looked at policy-based management evaluation modes, the policy administrator role, and controlling SQL Server surface area using policy-based management. That brings us to the end of this video, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.